to talk about that if you don't know what that was. So thank you so much for the invitation to speak today. I actually have to admit that I didn't know that it was World Water Day. And one of the reasons is that, as you're going to hear in the presentation, we're very focused at Water Bar on our local community. But because I learned that it was World Water Day, I thought I'd go check out what's World Water Day's theme this year. And I found out that the theme is Leave No One Behind. So I was reading about this, and it really aligns with a lot of the things I'm going to talk about, which is that 1 in 9 people around the world do not have access to clean water, and that disproportionately affects women, who in many communities are responsible for carrying water. And those of you who have worked with us at Water Bar know how heavy that is, and how difficult that is, and how much time that takes. But also that water crises disproportionately affect marginalized groups. People of color, people with disabilities. And so this is just something that I want to plant in the back of our minds, a little seed that we'll come back to later on. But I decided that instead of focusing my presentation on specific water issues, I wanted to talk about relationships. And one relationship in particular, which is the relationship that we all have with water, and with the Mississippi River specifically, here in the Twin Cities. Hello, River, and we're gonna all have a chance to say hello here. But before I jump in, I want to just talk a little bit about what I do. So Drew mentioned that I'm the co-director of Water Bar and Public Studio. Have any of you been to visit our storefront space in Northeast? Some of you? Any of you seen the pop-up around? I mean, besides today. So what we do at Water Bar is we serve water to build relationships and transform culture. I'll talk a little bit about that specifically, but I'm just one of the folks who make Water Bar. My title that my collaborator and I have given ourselves is Collaborative Director, and that really means that we're helping to direct these collaborations. And we have collaborations with many different artists, environmental organizations, water organizations, government, business, and we really work in that collaborative way. This is a picture of our storefront in Northeast. And just to give you a little bit of a snapshot of where I'm coming from, because you might wonder, how does a person become the co-director of a water bar? Which is kind of a strange thing. This is a picture of me and my grandmother. I grew up in a town of about 100 people up on the headwaters area of the Mississippi River, and my grandmother calls herself a water witch. And she swears that through using willow branch and dowsing, she found the well. That is the well that our family's farm is built on. And I shared that because up until last summer, I had never been out dowsing. But I asked my grandmother to take me, and one of the reasons was that I realized she has a lot of stories about land and about water and about the place I come from that I hadn't been listening to my entire life. I mean, she'd always talked about this thing that she called dowsing, and she's lived her entire life on the banks of the Mississippi River. But I really wanted to spend some time with her. So we went out, and it turns out I don't have the gift. but through my work at Water Bar, I'm actually always witching for water, is what it feels like. But the other thing to mention about that is that the place that I grew up is actually on the route of the Line 3 oil pipeline. I don't know if any of you guys have heard about this. And so another reason that my grandmother and I were out dowsing was I wanted her to talk to me about her thoughts about that. And what I realized is that what I was doing with my grandmother is what we really try to do at Water Bar, which is really be present with each other, listen to the land and to the water around us, and then also listen to one another. And through that process, we start to discover what water means in a different way than maybe we're used to thinking about that. So when Drew said, well, it's water, this will be easy for you. Water is such a big topic. But one of the things I wanted to do was make sure that I hit a couple of points that some of you might think have little to do with water. So I mentioned relationships. We're going to talk a little bit about racial and economic justice, because I think you can't talk about water and water issues without talking about that. I'm going to give some parenting tips, which I've gathered in my water witching work with my kids. And we're going to talk about what happens when you flush, and we're going to talk about this question of who cares. But first of all, I want to talk about, I was giving a presentation a few weeks ago for MSR architects. Are there any But someone in the audience at that event asked a really great question. They said, what's the most important conversation we can have right now about water? Does anyone want to throw out any words or phrases that come to mind? Like, what's the most important thing that we can talk about? There's no wrong answers. I'm just curious. Equity?
Scarcity and pollution.
Scarcity and pollution?
Climate change.
Climate change?
Access.
Access? Couple more?
Awareness.
Awareness?
Appreciation.
Appreciation?
Spiritual.
Spirituality and spiritual connections?
Source.
What was that one?
Source.
Source. Those are all great examples of the fact that water touches on so many things in our lives. At this panel, Ethan Neerdles, who's one of the collaborators at Water Bar and also part of the Indigenous-led Healing Place Collaborative, answered the question. And he said that the number one thing he thinks we can be talking about is that everyone should learn Dakota. So we're going to do that today. And I'm telling you this as a person who is not, I'm not a Dakota person, I'm not a native speaker, but through the work that we've been doing with Healing Place Collaborative, I've been fortunate to learn the importance of language and a few words. And I really feel it's my responsibility to share a little bit of what I've learned with you. And so we're going to start by, can you all read this phrase that's on this t-shirt here? Maybe? I'm going to read it to you, and then I'm going to have you guys say it back, okay? Does that sound good? And I'm hoping that I'm doing it justice. Makoche Kinde, Dakota, Tamakoche. And that means the Dakota people and this land belong together. Many of you have probably been to events where there have been Indigenous land acknowledgements, and those are a really important part of raising this conversation. And we think it's really important at Water Bar, and our collaborators think it's important to go beyond that and really talk about what that means and what that means to our work and to our responsibilities. Many of you might not know that you already speak Dakota a little bit because of where we live. So anyone know what this word means?
Water.
Water. Mani. Manioe. Did any of you visit Manioe this morning? At the Water Bar, that we do a version of Water Bar with the Dakota Language Society. Manioe is a place to gather water, like a well or a spring, but also a social space, like a water bar. Mini Sota Makoche, the place where the water reflects the sky, which is where we all live, Dakota home. So I want to encourage you to keep learning these things, and a really great way to do that is actually you can have Healing Place Collaborative bring Manioe or some of their other programs to your events, and on our website you can figure out how to do that, or you can talk to Jewel, who's here in the front row before you go today. Because it is so important to remember where we are. This is a picture of Bodote, which is where the Minnesota and the Mississippi rivers meet. And that's a place that you can visit and really think about these things. So we're going to talk a little bit about this idea: language, culture, social spaces. Why do these matter to water? But before that, I want to just make sure we all understand some really basic things. And I say this because I'm someone who doesn't come from a background in water resources, ecology, research. I came to this work out of curiosity. I wanted to know a little bit about where my water comes from, and that question led me and my collaborator Colin here on a journey. So imagine you're this river. This is a river. And the water flows like this. What is right here? If you're thinking about upstream and downstream, where's upstream? Right here. Yes, very good. Downstream. Just want to make sure, and there's nothing wrong with it not knowing those terms, but the reason that I want to share that is that one of the ways we think about the cultural work we're doing at Water Bar is to think about this idea of upstream and downstream. So really upstream is everything, right? Like not just the water that's flowing through a river, but everywhere rain falls makes its way to the river. So that's all upstream. We're all upstream. Culture and stories are upstream of behavior and policy. So this is something that we've been talking about and thinking about working with. The idea that if we want to change the ways that if we want people to change the ways that they relate to water and that they behave with regards to water and environment, or to make policies that are more sustainable, we really have to shift our culture. Because right now, our culture, we often think of water as an object. It's a resource, it's something that we extract, we put a price on it. But in Dakota culture, for example, water is not a resource, it's a relative. And so what does it mean to change your relationship with water, fundamentally? To think of the river as a relative and not just a resource. So when we talk about upstream here in Minnesota, Minnesota is a very special place in the fact that all of the rain that falls on Minnesota goes out of Minnesota. Like we don't have water flowing into our state from other places. We're a headwater state, 3 different watersheds. And so we have a responsibility. And I've been thinking a lot lately about this idea of responsibility when it comes to things like water and environment. And someone shared with me that to them the idea of responsibility means that we have an ability to respond. So it's not necessarily like it doesn't have to be thought of as a negative thing. It's really about what can we actually do if we have a responsibility. So all of this water, this is the Mississippi River watershed. All of this water flows to the Gulf of Mexico. So this is all upstream. So what we're doing with our work at Water Bar with arts and culture is that we're really trying to reconnect these things. We're trying to help people reconnect with their water source through drinking water and understanding where drinking water comes from, but recognizing that that opens up all kinds of other questions and ideas. So we sometimes take groups to drinking water plants. This is at our City of Minneapolis drinking water facility. Have any of you guys been there? A couple of you? Do you all, this is a good time to ask another question. Do you guys all know where your drinking water comes from? How many of you live in Minneapolis? Keep your hand up. How many of you live in St. Paul? Keep your hand up. Golden Valley? You all get your water from the Mississippi River. Also, if you live in St. Cloud, and a number of cities downstream. So in Minneapolis, we actually get our drinking water directly from the river, and then it's filtered and then shared with folks all across the city. So these are the kinds of conversations that we're having at Water Bar. We talk about where water comes from, the source of that water, and then depending who's behind the bar and who's at the bar visiting, the conversation goes in all kinds of places. We talk about all kinds of things. This is a picture from one of our events, a winter social. And one of the things about this photo that's interesting is that this represents farmers. So we have farmers behind the bar who've brought water from rural communities in Minnesota. We have neighborhood residents from Northeast. We have activists who are working on water and racial justice issues. We have our mayor of Minneapolis visiting here. And so it's a space where all of these folks can mix and mingle, and we can start to talk about how water means different things to different people, and what are we going to do collectively about that. So one of you mentioned climate change as an issue that affects water. This is a picture from Northeast Minneapolis. If you live in Northeast Minneapolis, you probably recognize that every time we get a really heavy rainfall, the streets flood. And that's happening more and more. We're getting these extreme weather events where our infrastructure, the pipes that bring that water away from the land and to the river are being overwhelmed. And so it's flooding. And these kinds of things are happening all over. Climate change is already impacting our environment. It's already having an impact on people. And so I mentioned that we were going to talk about racial and economic justice. This is one of those areas where that really intersects. Because the people who are most impacted by these kinds of things are the people who can least afford to deal with it. Amake Kubat was here. She was at the Water Bar earlier this morning, has a Water Bar project called Yo Mama's Watering Hole, where she talks about water and climate change from the point of view of women, low-income women. And through those conversations with the city, we've come to understand how important it is to have the people who are most impacted by these things at the table. And also defining what the table is. What questions are important to ask and what solutions are going to be most appropriate. We're also doing things with artists who have a vision for how they want to engage with nonprofit organizations. So this is an image from a buckthorn wreath making night that we did. And those of you who know about buckthorn is an invasive species that's kind of wreaking havoc on the river landscapes. And A lot of people really hate buckthorn. But Kim and Emily, who are the artists here, decided that rather than focusing their energy there, they wanted to use creativity to get to know the landscape better. So led a workshop with Friends of the Mississippi River, where they invited people to come learn about buckthorn, learn about the issue and how they can volunteer to pull buckthorn, but then use that buckthorn that's been pulled to make wreaths and then to burn them, because that's what you're supposed to do. Really fun to burn. So we're working in our storefront in Northeast, but we're also thinking about how water connects us across landscapes. And with water, a lot of water issues that are facing Minnesota, we can't just think in terms of our neighborhood, right, or our city. We have to think about upstream and downstream. And so we've started taking programs that we're creating here in Minneapolis and bringing them to small towns. Working with artists to have those conversations across rural, urban, and tribal communities. This is Jayanthi Kyle. She's one of the artists who's developing some workshops with us, and we took some of those workshops on the road to some breweries in some little towns last summer, and that was a really fruitful conversation where we could talk about the different water issues we face and how those things connect us. And then we also have a water bar project that we do every year at the Minnesota State Fair, which is really about bringing all of those conversations together. So over 12 days, we serve about 22,000 people, flights of water, talk about where that water comes from. And our bartenders come from all across Minnesota in those communities where we're getting that water, but then also from our state agencies. So the State Public Health Department and the Pollution Control Agency, our cities and our Metropolitan Council, those folks jump behind the bar and help to share what's going on with policies. So it's, again, another space for talking and for sharing stories. Research is also a really big part of all of this, and so this is a photograph of some of the folks who are part of a research collaborative that we lead with the University of Minnesota's Institute on Environment and the Weizmann Art Museum, where we're bringing artists, scientists, and activists and neighborhood community-focused artists together to talk about ways of knowing water. Science is one important way of knowing water, so is art, so is embodied experiences, spirituality, lots of different ways of knowing water. And so through that work, we're starting to come up with some curriculums and some public events and conversations that we can have. And I think the last thing that I'll share is that we're starting to develop now a water bartender school. So a way to have these conversations and to help people become everyday water educators. And so we're working with Freshwater, which is a nonprofit that has a deep history of working on issues of water quality and policies related to that. And then we're also working with a group of artists who are helping us to understand what a water tending school should be. What do we need to teach one another? What kind of stories do we need to share? And through some listening and some working with those artists and with our community, we've started to understand that water tending school isn't about knowing everything about water. It's really about asking questions and listening and trying to figure out how to bring those skills of empathy into our work as advocates, as researchers, as people who care in our communities. So this is a photograph of a water bar and some of the printmaking work that we do. And I go to a lot of water conferences and places where people are talking about the water issues that most impact us. And oftentimes these are things that are really scary. You know, if you think about climate change, if you think about how people, our lives are really at risk with a lot of things that are going on, it would be easy to be really depressed or to feel really overwhelmed. Can't do anything about this. And so one of the things that I just want to make sure that I leave you all with is this idea that we can do a lot just by changing the relationships and the ways that we relate to one another in our communities. And that should be a process that is joyful or real, that isn't necessarily about thinking of the worst possible scenarios, but really changing our imagination so that we can think about ways that we can help one another. And that's really at the root of the work that we're doing. So I want to give you guys some homework. And when I think about homework, I don't think about the kind of back in school when you had homework, but the idea that a lot of the work that we have to do happens at home. It starts with us as individuals and, like I said, our relationships with our families, with our children, with our communities. And one of the things that I found has been really helpful, I have a 3-year-old and a 6-year-old, and I'm trying to help them understand these kinds of things now, so that by the time they're in their 30s, they're not like me and just learning these things, right? And so one of the things that we've started to do is that we say hello to the river everywhere we see it. And that means that we start to recognize all the places where the river is, right? So we say hello to the river when we're actually at the river. We touch it. We start to look at it, understand how it's doing. We also say hello to the river on the landscape. So as we're walking around our neighborhood, we've seen these storm drains, and they say drains to river. That's actually what happens. And it comes directly out. And a lot of us don't know that. I think I grew up assuming that somebody treats that water, that it goes through some kind of process before it goes back into the river, but in fact it doesn't here. So everything we put on the land, all the little trash that we throw, what leaks out of our cars goes directly into the river. So we say hello here. And then we also say hello so realizing that it isn't just when you're at the river's edge that you say hello, thank you. It's when you're in the bathtub and every time you're drinking a glass of water. And so your homework, the homework that I would love for you all to think about doing, maybe in recognition of World Water Day, or just thinking about your own relationship with water, is this weekend, try to get to the river. Get as close as you can, touch the water, or recognize it in all the other places that you spent time. And some of you made these little prints, right? Did any of you pull them up? You got them? Those are also a reminder. So we made these little prints that say, hello river, thank you river. And those are things that you could put above your tap at home, or that you could share with someone that you know as a reminder to always do that. And as you do that, so what I've learned doing that with my children is that you start to really get a sense of how connected everything is. And that idea that the river is a relative and not a resource becomes real, because you start to say, well, if the river is a relative, how do we treat our relatives when they come into our home? We don't want to just like dump all this stuff on them and then like, see you later. Or maybe we do, I don't know. But we would be kinder, we would care, we would ask questions about what happens when we flush and where that water goes. Does anyone know what happens to the food? Yeah. It goes back to the river, right? So we have a metropolitan wastewater treatment plant that cleans that water and it gets returned back to the river. So we can also say, see you later, river, when we that's really all I wanted to share. Thank you all for hearing me, and I want to thank Colin here too, who's my core collaborator at Water Bar. He's kind of more of a behind-the-scenes person, but we are both working really closely on all this stuff. And then Jewel and Amake for joining here today and helping to serve